Recording in progress.
Hey guys, Onan here. So I'm going to be recording these in the car just to make it easier for me to fit in time to do it. It works pretty good for me to record it on on Zoom actually, but on my phone. So if you guys feel like you're getting a lot of background noise or it's hard to hear me, just let me know. So I had to fake an orgasm last night, and let me explain how and why. And let this should be clear from every one of these episodes, but especially clear from this one. Do not take theological or moral advice from me. You should absolutely form your own conscience. You should consult resources, consult priests, consult whoever you need to form your conscience about these matters. And I'm simply going to be transparent and truthful for you as to where I've been and where I'm at now and where I think I'm going. And you could take it with a grain of salt, take it for what it's worth, but I think there needs to be more honesty and transparency around these things. So, um, for the first, I would say, really over 20 years of our marriage, we did not use any contraception. We used natural family planning more or less, um, but we had a lot of kids, and so we had a lot of postpartum periods. Unfortunately for us, when my wife is breastfeeding on demand, um, she really doesn't get her cycles back for over a year for the most part. Um, Oftentimes it's 15 months or so is kind of the normal period from the birth of one child before cycles started coming back. And then usually if we wanted to, we would use NFP and extend that period. But for the most part, we never really extended it more than a few months, maybe 6 months. I'm trying to think how far our furthest space kids are. Probably I would, I would think our youngest was maybe around 2 when we would get pregnant again. So, I would say maximum of 5 or 6 months. We we've successfully used NFP up until after this most recent child. But for the most part, our abstinence hasn't been so much NFP, it's just the realities of trying to be parents of a bunch of kids and a bunch of little kids, which in my experience is the greatest barrier to intimacy is just little kids for a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, they just are not predictable. How and when they sleep, whether they wake up, where they sleep. We've often had little kids in the bed with us just so that mom could get a decent night's sleep. And so that's kind of one big reason why little kids are a major obstacle to intimacy and frequency. Probably the second and maybe more important factor is just moms are touched out. When you are a breastfeeding mom on demand, being interrupted at night multiple times, the last thing you really want to do at the end of the day is be touched that way. Even though the actual experience of having sex is good and enjoyable, if you are a mom and you are the constant center of attention for a needy infant or toddler, and especially if you are a responsive desire person, which my wife is, sex doesn't even enter her mind until she either purposely makes herself and or we're in the process of, starting to make out, so to speak. And so for us, we sort of settled into this rut. I don't know if you would call it a rut, a pattern for us that, um, for us, we would never really do it more than once a week. We kind of, I don't know, implicitly tried for once a week. I think in her mind, she sort of felt obligated to do it after a week. And so when I would we really didn't have to talk about it. You just kind of knew, oh, it's Sunday night. We just kind of knew, and if things worked out, we just kind of, went down that path and it happened and it was good. Like, I think if you ask my wife, I don't think she would say she had any disappointment in the quality of it. And I think for the most part, she really didn't have a problem with the frequency of it. Although I think, she's made it very clear if we didn't do it for weeks or months at a time, it wouldn't really matter to her. Um, and so for most of our marriage, it was kind of in that more or less infertile time period, but because of the realities of being parents to small kids all the time, once a week was the best we could do, and sometimes it was closer to every 2 weeks, maybe every 7 to 10 days was pretty regular. And I'm sure there's people that hear this be like, oh, I would do anything to have that. And I I don't necessarily fault you for that, but I'm just telling you that was my experience. And for me, that 3 to 5 day window um was fine. But once you got into that 5 days, the biology just kicks in, and PMAS, post marital act syndrome, becomes a real pain in the butt, or not the butt, someplace close to the butt. And so I would say, for the most part, and for the first 20 years of our marriage, 20 plus years of our marriage, it was very unusual for me to make it that week to 10 days without a solo act or two. And it wasn't that I didn't want to, and usually, and this is sort of the pattern it would take. The pattern it would take is I would, let's say, go to confession, having this, I don't know, on hindsight, laughable idea that this was the last time I'd have to go in and confess this. And so for the first couple of weeks, you're like, man, just hold it, last until Sunday, right? And so I could generally do that, but it was only a matter of time before it got to the point where it's either that or sleep, right? Or it's either that or not be able to sleep. And so eventually you just give in, you do some solo, you'd hate yourself afterwards, you'd feel guilty. You're like, well, I guess I guess things are clouded. So what's the point at this point in time? I'm gonna have to go to confession again. And so saying no the next time, once you've already kind of crossed the Rubicon, just becomes much, much easier because you already have to go to confession. You already have to skip communion, right? And so it just it becomes this way of life, even though you don't want to, and you firmly wish or want not to do it anymore, but nothing changes. You're still on this, what I would say is an infrequent schedule of intimacy with your spouse, which resets all that. And so solo was just a regular part of the fabric of my life. And it was this sort of constant, chronic source of moral frustration and guilt. And I would say over time, it became less about guilt and more about frustration because guilt guilt is there when you've done something wrong and you know it was wrong and you're like, that was like, obviously I shouldn't do that. But once you realize that there's not, just, you don't, not going to be able to stop it, and you realize that despite your best efforts, despite your best intended efforts to stop, it continues, it becomes less about guilt because, I mean, what are you guilty about? Just being you? I mean, that's what it becomes down to, is I guess you're guilty about being you because this is who you are. This is the way our bodies are, and it's just part of the fabric. And it's something that you go back and forth with. And for me, at least, it was a constantly revolving mixture of, I don't know, frustration, guilt, anger to my spouse, because I know if we were infertile, so it's not like we couldn't do it twice a week. It would be more of an inconvenience to her. So you develop this resentment for your spouse, which I didn't like. And at times I would divert my sort of resentment to God because God ultimately created all of this. And I really don't think it was my wife. I mean, just like I am who I am, my wife is who she is. And if I can't change who I am, why should I why should I expect my wife to change who she is? Now we all need to change, we all need to grow, but there's a certain level of ourselves that's just who we are. And so I would that was just kind of my life for 20 years. This was just that constant moral, physical annoyance in my life, and kept hidden from my wife for a bunch of reasons. I knew she'd be angry. I didn't really want to burden her. I didn't want her to feel obligated to increase the frequency. Um, I'm not a marital debt guy. I think that's far worse than solo activity. And and then I got caught one time, and I'm gonna play that for you. Some of you may have already heard that. I'm gonna be putting that out in an audio form here when I got caught going solo a year and a half ago, and it changed everything. I mean, it didn't it make everything perfect, but it changed everything in our marriage, where my wife really for the first time realized how different our experiences are. And when she found out and we talked, she's like, "Well, what kind of frequency would you need for this not to be a problem for you?" And I had to kind of make a real kind of quick, like I wanted, like I couldn't just say every day, right? And we were in the middle of one of these postpartum infertile periods at this time, so it wasn't like we had to deal with NFP at that time. It was just a matter of what are we going to make a commitment to. So I knew it couldn't be every day, but it sure needed to be more than 1 week. In hindsight, every but I said every 4 days. And she's like, okay. Or very little exception. We went to every 4 days, and I knew I just needed to make it to that fourth day. And I had no solo hiccups during that time. And in fact, I had very little temptation to do so. I mean, once you know it's going to happen and your spouse is, I would say, going to make more of a commitment to it, so that even when, I would say, inconveniences come up, maybe it's really late or you got, like they're more committed to staying on schedule. It takes so much of the mental and emotional pressure off that I really had zero struggle with the solo stuff. zero. And that was for probably, after basically 20 some years of always dealing with it, I went uh 4 or 5 months without a single hiccup, because that's how we approached it. Like, it truly does come down to how frequent can you be intimate. It's a biological thing that we've layered with this enormous spiritual, religious aspect to it, I guess. So that period was great. Um, and I was, like I said, for the first time in our entire marriage, felt like I didn't even have to think about this anymore. Like, it was such, like, it was positive, and I had no real um dread or frustration or anxiety over what I could trust. I could trust this part of our relationship. Well, you know, eventually cycles came back. We began using the Marquette method of natural family planning. And actually, at first, it wasn't too bad, because as the cycles came back, the I would say the abstinence window, I feel like the first few cycles was maybe only week and a half, something like that. But then it's grown over time, and now it's at least 2 weeks every time. 2.5 weeks is our average period. And I remember the first, I don't know, it was the first couple of cycles that started to get, the abstinence period started to get long. I still hadn't had any solo slip ups, but it was, we were going on, I don't know, day 10. And I was just so worn down by this. And I was literally in the middle of the night, standing down at the kitchen sink, just trying to breathe. And my wife, came down, and she's like, "What's going on?" I said, I'm not able to sleep. It's just too much right now." And of course, we couldn't just do something, because we feel very strong that having another child right now or at all isn't the right thing for us. And she's like, "What?" I don't know what she said. "What can I do, or what can we do?" And I says, "I don't know." I said, "The only thing I can think is to do some other acts type stuff." And full disclosure, we had some experience with this before we were married. We never had sex, but we did some other acts before marriage. Shouldn't have, but we did. And I basically said, "Well, we could probably try doing what we did before we were married." And she asked, "Well, can we do that? Doesn't it have to finish inside?" And I'm like, "Well, I guess it depends who you ask." And so I don't know if I would call it um coincidentally or maybe providentially, but I had just recently spoken with a priest and said, "What can we do?" And I asked specifically about other acts. Can we do that? And the priest told me, he said, "Well, there's a technical answer, and then there's a real answer." And he said, "The technical answer is no," but he said, "The real answer is God understands, and you shouldn't feel guilt about it." And so I basically communicated that to my wife. And so we did that, and it was very powerful, because now I had an outlet that wasn't solo. And my wife actually got to experience pleasure and sexual release without, number one, the fear of getting pregnant, and the two, without the mess. To be honest with you, I think she likes the lack of a mess inside as much as anything. And so we from there on, we essentially started incorporating that into the abstinence periods. And I would say, it's waxed and waned, but they'll say every 5, 6 days or so we'll do that. And what I can tell you is my wife gets much more out of that than I do, which is fine. Like I like being able to do that for her. But she's not all that skilled at making it, not even just making it pleasurable for me, but making it to the point where I can actually complete the task. And so we have been doing that really for the last 8 months or so, and it's helped a lot. I know it's helped her. Like there's something she gets out of that. Even though she doesn't really think about sex, there's just something that changes in a positive way for her that I know she looks forward to that, especially the closer you get to the ovulation. She really, really benefits from that. Her body needs that too, without getting pregnant. And so it's one of these things that's become much more of a benefit to her than it is to me, even though that was sort of the reason why we started. And and because it's not all that effective for me, I've kind of started requesting it less and less. And in perfect transparency, I just find solo to be more, I don't know, effective and efficient. And I'll be honest with you, I don't feel guilt about it. I I am just such a better, more calm person when I know I could just take care of this myself during those times when we can't be together. I I cannot see in any possible way why it's wrong, or if it's wrong, why it could be gravely wrong. I just don't see it. And again, don't take theological advice from me. But I absolutely do not see the reasoning and rationale for it. And in the study that I've done, it looks like it's based on a lot of old superstition that no one has been willing to confront. Who wants to be the proponent of masturbation, right? But once I got past that point, and I just I just find I have much more calmness and peace. It doesn't make it easy. It's not a replacement for the conjugal act. It's not. I still long for that. She still longs for that, and we have no trouble enjoying and doing that during those brief periods of the month where we can. So it all it does is it just reduces the anxiety a little bit. Doesn't take it away, doesn't eliminate PMAS, but it takes away that chronic fear of how am I going to get through the next 5 days, 10 days, 15, 20 days, whatever the case may be. It takes that load off of you and your marriage. And so that's why I don't believe it's wrong. My conscience feels very, very strong about this, and I'm following my conscience on that. Because I'm not going to go back to the agony that I put up with for 20 years. I'm just not going to do that. If I have to, I'll do this until we get through menopause and hope that life's different then. But I think even that's going to have its own issues. So last night, it had been a little while. We were probably, I don't know, 10 days into this abstinence period, which looks like doesn't, we haven't hit ovulation yet. So we have a minimum of 6 days left. I asked if she wanted to, and she said, sure. And we did. And she had a very good experience. And I couldn't get there. She's just not super skilled at it and doesn't seem to be real interested in learning how to get better. And so rather than push her and make her feel guilty, I faked it. And then when she went downstairs, I just finished the job. And so I faked it because I don't want to take it away from her simply because it doesn't really accomplish much for me yet. And just so we're clear, she's okay with hands, but there's no mouths going anywhere either way. No mouth on her, no mouth on me. And so that's the main reason. I've sort of tried to talk to her about that, but that's just not something she's comfortable with. And I'm not going to push her. So anyway, so that's the story of that. And I feel more or less at peace with this. And it is not easy. It's still a cross, but it's not totally interfering with the other aspects of our life and our marriage. And I'm deeply convinced this is really the how it's supposed to be, unless and until we're going to allow birth control, which I don't think is going to happen. This is really the only way couples can use NFP and be reasonably happy about it. So that's why I'm sharing it. This got a lot longer than I thought it would, but I think that I wanted to, but I thought it was important to share this. So wanted to share that with you guys. I appreciate you listening to this. I appreciate any comments you have, and I'll continue to bring this stuff to you. So anyway, appreciate everyone watching. And until next time, everyone, have a good one.